Everybody in Bracken had a laugh ready before she even climbed down off that wagon. I know because I was standing close enough to hear it come. That low, mean ripple that runs through a crowd when they've already decided a thing is funny before it's happened. Sam Hartwell brought his bride into town on a Tuesday, and by the time her foot touched the dirt of Main Street, half the county had a joke in its mouth. They laughed at her dress. They laughed at her silence. They laughed at the fact that Sam, a white rancher, a widower, a man who'd buried a wife and a little girl not 3 winters gone, had ridden up into the Chiricahuas a broken man and come back down married to an Apache woman. They had a word for her, and they used it like a thrown stone. I didn't laugh. But God forgive me, I didn't stop them either. What none of us knew, what the whole braying, sneering town of us couldn't have guessed, was that the woman we were laughing at had already saved a life none of us would have crossed a creek to save. And before that winter was through, she'd be the only thing standing between our children and the ground. This is the story of the day the laughing stopped. It's the story of what Sam Hartwell finally stood up in the street and told us. And it's the story of how a town full of decent, church-going people learned that the truth about somebody is almost never the thing you laughed at first. My name's Eli Weathers. I whittle birds for a woman who's been dead 11 years, and I've told a lot of lies in my time. This ain't one of them. The first sound I remember from that Tuesday wasn't the laughing. It was the wagon wheel, a dry, complaining squeal, iron on wood, the kind of noise that means a hub's gone thirsty and nobody's greased it in 100 miles. I heard it before I saw the wagon come around the bend by Callum's store, and I remember thinking, in that useless way a man's mind wanders, that Sam ought to know better than to run a rig dry. Then the wagon came clear of the storefront, and I forgot all about the wheel. I was sitting on the bench outside the feed office where I always sat when I came in for the ranch's mail, whittling. I keep a knife and a block of soft pine in my coat, and my hands do their business whether I ask them to or not. That day I was working a wren, small, round-breasted little thing, the 11th one I'd started that year, though I hadn't finished but 4. Ruth liked wrens. Used to say they were too plain to be vain and too loud to be sorry, and that if she came back as any bird, it'd be that one. So I whittled them. Don't ask me why a grown man does a thing like that. I stopped asking myself a long time ago. I had the wren's head between my thumb and the blade when the crowd started to gather, and I felt the change in the street before I understood it. You live long enough in a small place, you learn the weather of a crowd. There's a good gathering, the kind that comes when the mail coach is in, or a fiddler's set up, or somebody's calf has gotten loose and the whole street's laughing and hollering after it. That's a warm crowd. It moves loose. This one moved tight, shoulders in, heads together, and under it that low sound. Sam Hartwell drove the wagon slow up the middle of Main, the way a man drives when he knows exactly what's waiting for him, and has decided he's going to walk right into it with his chin up rather than sneak around the back. He had his hat pushed off his forehead so you could see his eyes, and his eyes weren't looking at anybody. They were looking at a fixed point about 100 yards ahead, somewhere past the church, and he drove toward it like it was the last dry ground in a flood. Beside him on the bench seat sat a woman. I want to be careful how I tell this, because the man I was that Tuesday and the man I am now telling it are not the same, and I owe her the truth of both. The man I was that Tuesday saw an Apache woman in a plain gray dress that didn't fit her right, store-bought. I'd learn later, and bought in a hurry, sitting straight-backed on the seat of Sam Hartwell's wagon with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level. She was maybe 30. Hard to say. She had a face that gave you nothing, and I mistook that for having nothing behind it, which is the kind of mistake a man makes when he's already made up his mind. Her hair was black and pulled back plain. There was a scar, faint, running from the corner of her left eye down toward her jaw, thin as a thread, the kind of mark that healed clean a long time ago. She wore no jewelry but a single band of hammered copper on her wrist, worn smooth. That's what I saw, a stranger, an outsider, a problem Sam had brought home. What I didn't see because I wasn't looking, because none of us were, was that she was terrified. I know it now. I've had 11 years to learn it. A person can sit straight and level and give you a face of stone and be, underneath it, so afraid that every breath is a decision. She'd walked into a town that had already tried and hanged her in its heart, and she did it sitting up straight because sitting up straight was the only thing left that belonged to her. The laughing started slow. It always does. Bud Callum was the first, leaning in the doorway of his store with his apron on and a plug of tobacco in his cheek. He said something to the man beside him. I didn't catch it. My left ear's been half dead since a mule kicked the sense out of it in '71, and the man beside him snorted, and that snort spread. It went down the boardwalk like fire down a fuse. By the time the wagon reached the middle of the street, there were 40 people making that sound, and a few of them had put words to it. "Well, hell, Hartwell, thought you went up there for cattle. That your idea of a good winter's work, Sam?" And worse, there was a word going around, low, passed hand to hand like a coin. And I'll not print it here because she doesn't deserve to have it printed anywhere near her name ever again, but they used it, and they used it grinning. Ada Callum, Bud's wife, stood at the front of the crowd with her youngest on her hip, little Reuben, couldn't have been more than 2, and she looked the woman on the wagon up and down the way you'd look at spoiled meat. And she said, loud enough to carry, loud enough to be meant to carry, "Eliner's not been in the ground 3 years." That one landed. I saw it land. Sam's jaw moved just once, a small tightening at the hinge, and his hands got white on the reins. But he didn't stop the wagon, and he didn't turn his head. He drove on toward that fixed point past the church, and the woman beside him kept her chin level, and the town laughed at the both of them all the way up the street. I sat on my bench with a half-carved wren going soft in my sweating hand, and I didn't laugh. I want that on the record for whatever it's worth, which I've come to understand is not much. I didn't laugh, but I didn't stand up either. I didn't call out that Ada Callum ought to be ashamed of herself, using a dead woman as a knife. I didn't say that whatever Sam Hartwell had done up that mountain, he'd earned the right to do it, and that a man who'd lost what Sam lost had earned the right to be left the hell alone. I thought all of those things. I thought them clear as church bells. And I sat there and let my hands whittle and said not one word. "You're a coward, Eli," I heard Ruth say, plain as if she'd been sitting next to me. She had a way of turning up in my head at the exact moment I'd have paid money for her to stay quiet. You've always known when a thing was wrong, and you've always sat on your hands. "Not now, Ruth," I said under my breath, and the man next to me gave me a funny look, and I put the wren away. Here's what the town knew about Sam Hartwell, or thought it knew, which in Bracken amounted to the same thing. They knew he ran the Willow Bar, a middling spread out along the creek east of town. Good grass, bad luck. They knew he'd married Alina Reesback when they were both young and full of the future, and that Alina had given him a daughter, a bright little thing named Grace with her mother's laugh, and that the winter of '83 a fever had come through and taken both of them inside of 9 days. Took Alina first. Grace held on 4 more days after her mother, 4 days of Sam sitting up with her and singing every song he knew until his voice gave out, and then she went too. He buried them under the 2 willows the ranch was named for, side by side, and after that Sam Hartwell stopped being a man the town knew what to do with. He didn't drink himself to death, which is what folks half expected, and if I'm honest, half hoped, because a man drinking himself to death is a story a town can tell and understand. He didn't do anything so tidy. He just went quiet, ran his cattle, came to town for supplies, and left before the second word of any conversation. Stopped coming to church. When people said Alina's name to him, trying to be kind mostly, in that clumsy way people are, he'd nod and look at the ground and wait for them to be done. And then, the winter before this one, he'd gone up into the Chiricahuas after a bunch of strays that had drifted up into the high country, and he hadn't come back. 2 weeks he was gone. A posse went partway up and turned around when the snow came in, turned around. I'll note, at the first real hardship, which tells you something about how much the town of Bracken thought Sam Hartwell was worth even then. They came back down and told each other he was dead, and they were sorry, and they meant it about as much as people mean that sort of thing. He came down off that mountain in the first thaw, on a horse that wasn't his, with his right leg splinted in a way no doctor would have done it, bound in green willow and rawhide, straight and clean, and a woman riding behind him. That was 14 months before the Tuesday I'm telling you about. He'd kept her out at the Willow Bar all that time. Folks had seen her, distant, a figure at the well or crossing the yard. Rumors grew like they do. But he hadn't brought her to town, hadn't married her before God or the county until that Tuesday. And I've wondered since why he chose that day to do it, to drive her right up the middle of Main Street in the light where everyone could sneer. I think it was because he was done being ashamed of the one thing in his life that had gone right. I think a man can only take so much of hiding a good thing before hiding it starts to feel like the same sin as being ashamed of it. I think he woke up that Tuesday and decided the town could laugh, and he'd let them, because their laughing didn't change what was true. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That day, I didn't know any of that. That day, I just watched a wagon go up a street and a town make an ugly sound. And then I went and got the ranch's mail and rode home and didn't think about it too hard. Because not thinking about things too hard was a skill I'd spent 11 years perfecting. I worked the Willow Bar. Have I said that? I'm the foreman out there, was then, and am now what's left of me. So it wasn't but 2 days later that I saw her up close, and that's when the first crack showed in the picture I'd painted of her in my head. It was near dusk, and one of the hands, a jug-eared kid named Powley Dietz, had torn his forearm open on a length of barbed wire, ripped it good, from the wrist near to the elbow, and the blood was coming faster than any of us liked. We were out by the north fence, a good hour's hard ride from Doc Prentice in town, and Paulie'd gone the gray-green color a young man goes when he sees his own insides and starts to think seriously about fainting. I'd wrapped it in my neckerchief, and we'd got him back to the yard, and I was hollering for somebody to saddle a fresh horse for the ride to town when she came out of the house. She didn't hurry, that's the thing I remember. Everybody else in that yard was moving fast and loud and to no purpose, the way people do around blood, and she came across from the house at a walk, wiping her hands on a rag, and she looked at Powley's arm the way I look at a fence line, reading it, checking it, seeing where the trouble was. "Sit him down," she said. Those were the first words I ever heard her speak. Her English was accented but clear, unhurried. Not the ground, the bench, head between his knees. We sat him on the bench. She unwound my sopping neckerchief, and I saw her face while she looked at the wound, and there was no squeamishness in it. None of that flinch a person gives at another person's pain. There was only attention. She pressed 2 fingers hard just above the tear, up near the inside of his elbow, and the fast, dark welling of it slowed to a seep. "You," she said to me, not looking up. "There's a wooden box in the kitchen by the stove with a lid. Bring it." I went. I don't know why I went so fast for a woman I'd sat and let a town laugh at 2 days before, except that there are people who, when they speak in the middle of trouble, you simply do what they say, and she was one of them. I brought the box. Inside it were bundles, dried plants, some I knew, most I didn't, and clean cloth, and a small horn cup, and a bone needle wrapped in wax thread. She packed the wound with something she crushed between her palms first, a gray-green mash that smelled sharp and clean, like the smell after rain in the sage. She threaded the bone needle, and then with Powley white and shaking and gripping my hand hard enough to grind the bones, she sewed his arm shut, quick and even 14 stitches, her hands never once hurrying and never once slow. When she was done, she bound it in clean cloth and told Powley he'd keep the arm if he kept the binding clean and didn't work it for 2 weeks, and that if he saw red lines climbing up from it, toward his heart, he was to come to her that same hour and not be a proud fool about it. Then she gathered up her box and went back into the house at the same unhurried walk. I stood in that yard with Powley's blood drying on my hands, and I thought about the word I'd heard passed up and down the boardwalk 2 days before, the ugly one, and I thought about Ada Callum's face, and I thought about my own hands whittling a wren while I let it all happen. And something turned over in me slow, the way a heavy stone turns over in a creek bed when the water finally gets high enough. There's more to her than the town could hold, I thought. I didn't have better words for it than that. There's more to her than the town could hold in its head all at once, so it laughed, because laughing is what a small thing does when it meets a big one and can't understand it. "Well," said Ruth, dry as August, "look who finally opened his eyes." I didn't answer her that time. I went and washed the blood off my hands and looked at the mountains going purple in the last light, and I had the first cold feeling, I couldn't have named it then, that the town of Bracken had laughed at exactly the wrong person, and that we were all of us going to find out how wrong, and soon. I didn't know how soon. That same night, 3 miles away in town, the Prout boy started coughing. The Prout boy's cough was the first, but it was Doc Prentice riding out to the Willow Bar 11 days later that told me how bad it had gotten. Prentice was not a man who rode out to the Willow Bar. He and Sam had a coolness between them that went back to the fever winter. Some said Prentice had been slow coming out when Alina took sick, said he'd been drunk, said a lot of things. And whether they were true or not, Sam had never forgiven him, and Prentice had never forgiven Sam for the not forgiving. So when I saw the Doc's gray horse coming up the ranch road in the last of the afternoon, moving hard, I knew before he opened his mouth that something in Bracken had come apart. He wouldn't get down off the horse, that's a thing I noticed. He sat there sweating in the cold, and his hands were shaking on the reins, and he wouldn't get down. "Where's Hartwell?" he said. Sam came out. The two men looked at each other across the yard the way they always did, and then Prentice said the thing he'd ridden 3 miles into country he hated to say. "It's the strangling sickness," he said. "Diphtheria, it's in the children. I've got Sam, I've got 9 of them down. The Prout boy's dead. The Ochoa girl's dead. I buried them this morning, both, and there's 9 more and I can't." His voice cracked and he pressed the back of his wrist to his mouth and got hold of himself. "I can't do anything. I paint their throats and I steam them and they choke anyway. There's a membrane grows across the windpipe. It grows and the child suffocates, and I stand there and watch, and I cannot do one goddamned thing." He said it to Sam, but his eyes, I noticed, kept flicking to the house, to the door of it. "Word is," Prentice said, and now he was talking fast, ashamed and desperate both. "Word is you're the woman. Word is she knows sicknesses, doctoring. The Dietz boy's arm, half the county's heard about the Dietz boy's arm. I don't, Sam, I've got a mother in town right now holding a child who won't live till morning, and I've got no pride left. Do you understand me? I have run clean out of pride. I am asking." Sam didn't say anything for a long moment, and I understood, watching him, that this was a harder thing than Prentice knew he was asking. Because to say yes was to send her, the woman the town had laughed at, the woman they had a stone word for, into that town, into its houses, to lay her hands on its children. To ask her to walk into the middle of everything that hated her and spend herself for it. Sam turned and looked at the door of the house, same as Prentice had, and she was standing in it. She'd come to the doorway sometime while Prentice was talking, quiet as she did everything, and she'd heard all of it. I've thought a great deal about what was on her face in that moment, and I've never come to the bottom of it. There was no eagerness, I'll tell you that. Whatever else the storybooks might want, there was no shining light of mercy in her face, no saint's readiness to forgive. There was something harder and more honest than that. There was a person doing arithmetic with her own life. There was a woman looking at a town that would have watched her hang, and weighing what she owed it, which was nothing, against what she knew, which was everything, and finding the two things would not balance no matter how she set them. She looked at Sam, not at Prentice, at Sam, and something passed between them that I had no part in and no right to, a whole conversation in one look, the kind of thing that grows between two people who have kept each other alive. And I understood then that I didn't know the half of what those two were to each other. So let me tell you now the part I learned later, because you can't understand what she decided that evening in the doorway unless you understand what the mountain had given back. Sam told me most of it himself, one night that winter when the both of us were too tired to sleep and too raw to keep our mouths shut. Some of it she told me, later still, in her own words, few and exact. I've stitched it together the best I can. The strays had drifted high, up past the tree line, and Sam had gone after them alone because he was a stubborn man, and because, I think, some part of him didn't much care if he came back. A man who's buried his wife and his child takes risks a whole man wouldn't. He'll climb after 4 cows into country that's killed better riders, and he'll tell himself it's about the cows. His horse went down on a scree slope, went down and rolled, and Sam's leg was under it when it did. And when the dust settled, he had a shattered shin, the bone come clean through the skin, and a horse with a broken neck, and he was alone at 8,000 feet with the snow coming. He should have died. By every law of that country, he should have died up there, and the melt would have given his bones back in the spring for the coyotes, and Bracken would have said what a shame, and forgotten him inside a year. Tawny found him on the 2nd day. Her people, what was left of them, were up in that country, because up in that country was the only place left where they could be. This was 85. The wars were all but done. The bands were being run down and shipped off to Florida, to Alabama, to die in the wet heat so far from home that some of them, she told me once, thought they'd already died, and this was the afterworld the whites had made for them out of spite. Tawny's band was a handful, an old man, some women, a few children, the wreckage of something that had once been a people. They were hiding. They were starving. They were moving at night and keeping no fires, and one wrong sound, one column of smoke, and the soldiers would come, and that would be the end of them. And into the middle of that, into the middle of a starving, hunted remnant that could not afford one extra mouth, that could not afford the noise of him, she found a white man with a broken leg, one of the very kind of men who'd made her people into a remnant in the first place. The right thing by every hard law of survival was to leave him, or worse, he was helpless, he'd have never known. She told me years on in the plain way she said the hardest things. My grandmother was killed by men who called us animals, and I looked at this man and I thought if I leave him, they were right. If I become the thing they said I was, then they made me and they win even the inside of me. She'd looked at me with those level eyes. So I did not leave him, not for him, for myself. I would not let them have the last part of me. She said his leg. She'd learned setting bones and packing wounds and reading fevers from her grandmother and her grandmother's sister, the women who held that knowledge, generations of it, plants and pressures, and the long, patient art of keeping a body alive. She splinted Sam's shattered shin with green willow and rawhide, straight and clean, the same clean work I'd see on Powley Dietz's arm a year on. She and one of the other women dragged him on a travois to a rock shelter. And for 3 weeks, while her band starved and hid and buried one of their own children in a stone crevice because the ground was frozen too hard to dig, for 3 weeks, she kept Sam Hartwell alive. The fever came into the wound and she broke it, the bone knit. And in those 3 weeks in a rock shelter with the wind screaming outside, 2 people who had every reason on earth to hate each other found instead that they were, underneath all of it, the same kind of ruined, each of them the last standing thing of a family the world had taken. They didn't have a common tongue, hardly. They built one word by word. He learned her hands, she learned his silences. When he could ride, her band was already scattering. The soldiers had gotten close, and they'd had to split up to survive, the old man taking the children south toward Mexico, the others gone their own ways into a country that had no place for them. Tawny had nowhere. Her people were smoke on the wind. She could go south and likely die, or go with this man to a valley and a house, and a name that might buy her enough safety to live. She chose to live, and Sam Hartwell, who'd thought he was done wanting anything on this earth, found that he wanted her too. That was what the mountain gave back, not the cows. He never found the cows. It gave back a man who'd gone up there half hoping to die, and it sent him down married in his heart to the only person alive who'd looked at his ruin and stayed. So when Doc Prentice sat sweating on his gray horse in the Willow Bar yard and asked her to come save the children of the town that laughed at her, that was the weight of it. That was what she was holding. She'd already once refused to become the thing they said she was. She'd already once chosen up on that mountain to save the enemy rather than let the world win the inside of her. And now the world was asking her to do it again, only this time it was children, and this time the whole town would watch. And this time, though nobody in that yard knew it yet but her and Sam, she was 3 months carrying a child of her own. That's the part I didn't know until much later. She was carrying, and the strangling sickness takes the ones already alive, and it can take the ones not yet born too, through a mother's own fever and exhaustion. To go into that town was to risk her own child to save the children of people who'd have spat on it. I've had 11 years to think about what kind of a decision that is, and I've never found the bottom of it. I don't think there is a bottom. I think it's just a place a person can be, where every road costs you everything, and you have to pick one anyway, standing in a doorway in the failing light with a doctor begging, and a town waiting to be surprised. She looked at Sam, and then she looked past him at Prentice and she spoke. "The 9 that are down," she said. "How long have the first ones had it?" "6 days, some of them," Prentice said. 7. She was quiet, working it. "Some are already too far," she said, not unkindly, just true. "I will not be able to save all of them, you understand this. If I come and a child dies, they will say the Apache woman killed it. You understand this too." Prentice's face did something terrible. "I understand it," he said. "God help me, I know exactly what they'll say." "Then say it now," she said. "Say it back to me so that later you cannot pretend you did not know. Some will die no matter what I do, and they will blame me for those, and they will not thank me for the rest." "Yes," Prentice said. "Yes, that's likely how it'll go." She nodded slow, like a person accepting the terms of a debt they never asked to owe. "Get my box," she said to me. "The big one and the black jar from the shelf wrapped so it does not break." And to Sam, lo, in that private register the 2 of them had, "You will come, and you will not let them near me with a rope while I have my hands inside a child." "No," Sam said, "I won't." That was all. She went to change into clothes she could work in. Prentice sagged on his horse like a cut rope, and I stood in the yard with the cold coming down, understanding for the first time in my useless life what it costs a person to be better than the world that's laughing at them. And understanding, too, that I was about to watch the town of Bracken be shown exactly who it had laughed at, and that not one of us was going to come out of it the same. We rode for town in the dark. They'd laid the sick children in the church, because it was the only building big enough and because, I suspect, some part of the town wanted them close to God when it happened. When we came in out of the dark, the place was lit yellow with lamps, and it was full of a sound I have never gotten out of my ears and never will, the sound of children fighting for air. A dry, tearing, whistling sound, over and over from a dozen small chests. It filled that church to the rafters. It was the sound of the strangling sickness, and once you've heard it, you understand why they call it that. It is the sound of a rope no one can see. The mothers were with them. The fathers stood along the walls with their hats in their hands, useless, the way men are. And when Tani came through the door, the whole church turned. For one held breath, nothing happened. And then the muttering started, and I saw Bud Callum come off the wall, and I saw a couple of the men's faces harden into that ugly, familiar shape. And I understood that the thing she'd warned us about was already trying to happen, that even here, even now, with their children choking on the pews, some of them would rather. That's enough. It was Sam, he didn't shout it. Sam Hartwell was not a shouting man. He said it flat and hard into the middle of that church, and something in the way he said it stopped the room. He stepped up in front of her, not blocking her, standing beside her, which is a different thing, and he took his hat off, slow, and he looked around at the town of Bracken, at the men along the walls, at Prentice, at Ada Callum, who was there with her older girl Gray on a pew and little Reuben clutched white-knuckled on her hip, at all of us. And Sam Hartwell, who hadn't said 40 words in that town in 3 years, told them the truth about her. You laughed at her, he said, 2 weeks back, right out there in the street. I heard every one of you. His voice was steady, but there was something under it, banked like coals. So before she puts her hands on your children, you're going to hear who she is, and then you can decide what you want to do about it. The church was dead quiet, but for the children's breathing. 2 winters ago, I broke my leg up in the Chiricahuas. The bone came through the skin. My horse was dead and the snow was coming, and I was 8,000 feet up with no way down. He turned his hat in his hands. You sent a posse. It turned back at the first snow. You went home and you told each other I was dead, and you were right, I was dead, near as makes no difference. I lay up there 2 days waiting to die, and I wasn't even scared anymore, I was just cold, and I thought about Alina, and I thought about Grace, and I thought, well, maybe this is how I get back to them. Nobody breathed. She found me, Sam said, and his voice caught once, and he pushed through it. Her people were starving, hunted. She had no food to spare and no strength to spare, and every reason under God's sky to leave me lay there. I was the same as the men who'd done to her people what was done to them. She had every right to walk on by, or worse. He looked at them. She set my leg. She carried me to shelter. She broke the fever in the wound with her own hands when it should have killed me, and she kept me alive 3 weeks while her own people buried a child in the rocks because the ground was too froze to dig. His jaw worked. You laughed at her dress. That woman carried a grown man down a mountain. You want to laugh at something, laugh at that. I looked around that church and I watched it land. I watched Bud Callum's face come apart. I watched men who'd snorted on a boardwalk look at the floor. She didn't have to come here tonight either, Sam said, quieter now. You know what you are to her. She knows what you are to her. And she came anyway because she knows how to fight this thing and Prentice doesn't, and because there are children in this room who will be dead by morning if she doesn't. She's not doing it for thanks. She won't get any, and she knows it. She's doing it because she is a better person than this whole town put together. And that, his voice went ragged. That is the truth about her. And now you've heard it, so somebody bring her hot water and clean cloth and get the hell out of her way. And the town of Bracken, that had laughed, moved. I won't tell you it was tidy. It wasn't. Redemption never is, that's the lie the storybooks sell. Ada Callum didn't fall weeping to her knees and beg forgiveness. Bud didn't become a good man in an evening. What happened was smaller and truer than that. The town got out of the way, and it fetched water, and it did what it was told, and shame does its slow work in a person over years, not minutes. Tawny worked through the night and into the next day and into the night after that. I was there for most of it, and I have never seen anything like it before or since. She had them build steam, kettles going on the church stove, boiling water with a handful of something from her black jar dropped in. So the whole place filled with a sharp medicinal cloud that made your eyes run, but that loosened the tearing in the children's chests. She had the worst ones held upright, never flat, always up, because flat is how the rope tightens. She made a bitter tincture and got it down their throats a spoon at a time, patient past all understanding, hour after hour. And for the two children where the membrane had grown too far across the windpipe, where the child was blue and going, she did a thing I still don't have the stomach to describe in full, with a hollow reed and her steady hands and Prentice White and praying beside her, that opened an airway below the strangle and let a suffocating child pull in one whistling, blessed, screaming breath. She saved 7 of the 9. 2 she could not. She told Prentice she wouldn't be able to save them all, and she was right, and being right about it did not make it one grain easier. I watched her lose the Hollies boy near dawn of the second day, watched her work over him long past when Prentice had stepped back, and when she finally lifted her hands and closed his eyes, she sat back on her heels and her face. The face I'd thought 2 weeks before was made of stone, the face that gave you nothing, her face broke, for just a moment wide open, and I saw the whole cost of her in it. Then she wiped it flat again and went to the next child, because the next child was still alive and needed her, and grief would have to wait its turn like everything else in her life had always had to. The other one she lost was Ada Callum's youngest, little Reuben, the one on Ada's hip in the street the day she used Aliner's grave as a knife. The one on her hip in the church, or the night she'd have turned Tawny away. He came down with it the second night, sudden and hard the way it takes the littlest ones, and Tawny fought for that child harder than I saw her fight for any of them. I think she knew whose he was. I think that's exactly why. I think some furious, stubborn, magnificent part of her decided that of all the children in that church, Ada Callum's baby was the one she would not lose, that she'd save the child of the woman who hated her most just to prove that her hands were bigger than that hate, and the sickness didn't care. The sickness never cares. It took him near midnight in her arms, with Ada screaming and Sam holding Ada back and Tawny's hands still moving over the boy long after there was any use in it. And here is the thing I carried out of that church, the thing 11 years and 100 whittled birds haven't worn smooth. When it was done, when little Reuben was gone, Ada Callum broke free of Sam, and I thought, God help me, we all thought she was going for Tawny's throat. She came at her across that church like a landslide. And Tawny didn't flinch. She was too emptied out to flinch. She just knelt there with the dead child in her lap, and she looked up at Ada coming, and she held the boy out to his mother, both arms, an offering, the plainest and most terrible thing I ever saw one grieving woman do for another. Ada stopped, she took her son. And then she folded down onto the floor of that church with him and made a sound no person should have to make. And after a moment, after a long moment, Tawny put her arms around the both of them and held on, and Ada Callum, who had a stone word for her, let her. They knelt there together on the floor, the woman who'd laughed and the woman she'd laughed at, holding a dead child between them, and there was no triumph in it. Don't let anyone tell you there was. It wasn't a victory. It was just two people at the bottom of the same grief, which is the only place I've come to believe that some people can finally see each other. Tawny's own child came in the spring, healthy, a girl. She named her a name in her own tongue that meant. Sam told me something close to the one who stayed. I never learned to say it right, but I know what it meant. And it meant her people weren't smoke on the wind after all, not entirely, not while the child breathed. The town changed, and it didn't. Some folks came round. Bud Callum, to his credit, never passed Sam on the street after that without a nod, and once, years on, I saw him tip his hat to Tawny, stiff and awkward and meant. Others never did come round. There were people in Bracken who took the truth about her to their graves and hated her anyway, because there are people who would rather hold their hate than admit they were wrong, and no sickness and no sacrifice will ever cure that particular disease. Ada Callum was the one none of us could have called. She lost her boy and she was never whole again, and yet, or maybe because she and Tawny grew to be something the English language doesn't quite have a word for. Not friends, deeper and stranger than friends. Two women bound by a dead child and a night on a church floor who understood each other in a place too far down for anybody else to follow. Ada's the one who taught Tawny to read in the end. Tawny's the one who sat up with Ada the winter Bud died. Go figure a thing like that. As for me, I'm the fool who sat on a bench and whittled a wren while a town laughed at the best person to ever come through it and said not one word. I've spent 11 years trying to make that right, in the small ways a small man can. I taught her girl to ride. I fixed Sam's fences and kept his books and buried him, 3 years back, under a third willow beside Alina and Grace. And Tawny stood at that grave dry-eyed and level-chinned the way she'd sat in that wagon the first day, and only I was close enough to see her hand shaking. She's still out at the Willow Bar. Runs it herself now, her and the girl, and runs it better than Sam ever did. The town buys her beef and calls her Mrs. Hartwell to her face, and God knows what behind her back, and she doesn't care, hasn't cared in years, is past caring the way you get past caring about weather. I finished the wren finally. The 11th one took me all this while. I brought it out to her last week. Didn't rightly know why, just knew it belonged out there more than on my windowsill. And I set it on the porch rail and told her some fool story about Ruth and wrens and why I carved them.